But I did want to bring up again for next week that with not having class, that we'll have a lecture set up, and I'll send you guys an email with all that to let you guys know when it's up, and it'll be on the Moodle course. It'll be up on the Moodle course for you guys to see on week 5, and so I did want to bring that up. But before we start the lecture, to get back on topic with that, is that there isn't enough time, again with having another day off, to be able to delve into some of the necessary sources. I'll make allusions to it, but as far as the focus on where it'll be, that there isn't enough time here to spend on the role of women specifically in Old Testament narratives. I know I spend some time on it in Intro to Biblit, but there is a role that women play within the Old Testament. More specifically, these Old Testament narratives as they involve the patriarchs, because as we'll talk about today, that it is male heavy. Part of that is the context in which these stories are being written, but I also do not want to just credit, well, it's the context, so we're not going to talk about the ladies in the story, when so much of the roles that they have to play within the story are pivotal events that they play. Not only from Sarah's laughing and then getting named Isaac, that's how he gets his name, to what the deal that Rebecca cuts with Jacob because she favors Jacob, and that's how she kind of reverses the roles of the blessing, and Jacob ends up being the blessed one. And then also the role that women will play in the narratives that pertain to the birth of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so I do want to bring those things up, not just as roundabout kind of things that we discuss when it's Women's Appreciation Day or Women's Month, but just as a part of the essential part of the story. And so I am going to, again, to bring the two together, there's a message here by Dr. Kane Hope Felder, again, African-American New Testament scholar, who brings up certain points that I believe not only are important for us to recognize, but then also important for us to remember as we're talking through the patriarchal narratives here this afternoon. So
I think it's our task as we look throughout this month at the way in which the Bible, yes, to be sure, there are texts of terror as full of trouble as remind us of women who are depicted in a patriarchal society so negatively through the Bible. That's there. Thankfully, it's not the only depiction of women in the Bible. So how can we focus the spotlight?
It's not that loud.
okay, let me start this thing over. I think what's happened is that it's like picking up the speakers. Let me do this. Oh, but now it took away the sound. Let me do this.
I think it's our task as we look
Not better?
throughout this month at the way in which the Bible, yes, to be sure, there are texts of terror as Phyllis Tribble has reminded us of women who are depicted in a patriarchal society so negatively through the Bible. That's there. Thankfully, it's not the only depiction of women in the Bible. So how can we focus the spotlight on some of these texts in which the Lord demonstrates that a mighty thing of transformation is taking place, not through the men who made Israel, the men who make America, but the women who get and have gotten precious little credit for the role that they have played and continue to play to keep the institutional church floating, viable, alive, and ready for action. The women. And I think that this needs to be said by men more often, not just to have the women have to tout their circuits. No. We really arrive when the women's liberation, the womanist, the feminist perspectives become part of our own daily vocabulary, and that in our own practice that we demonstrate that an appreciation other than Women's Day. Why can't it be Women's half the year? Amen. Because it is, but it's not celebrated. So we just want to say there are these items that we would lay before you when we think of preaching.
Okay, thank you, brother. So, again, that being said, one of the things we're going to go through for today is talking about some of the patriarchal narratives that we have within the Old Testament. But again, likewise, to recognize that it's not just men that are shaping these stories that we have within the Old Testament, that women do have a powerful role to play in the way they not only interact um, with the text, but then also interact with God. And when I say with the text, interact with the characters within the text through their interactions. And so, again, um, because we don't have the sake of because we don't have a ton of time, let's go ahead and get started here as we talk about. Um, there we go. Pentateuch. So, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to get through the flood and Babel in its contexts, and then we're going to get through to the patriarchs. So flood and Babel in its context, and then the patriarchs. But one of the things I do want to remind you, again, of sin and its consequences. One, how we define sin, not just as disobedience or not just as pride generally, but more specifically as rebellion, and how this disobedience or rebellion will invite chaos that disorders, creates chaos within creation's created order. We had talked a few weeks back about how Genesis 1 is God ordering the cosmos according to his, not necessarily his plan, but how God's ordering the cosmos kind of from the top down, and then filling in these specific habitats and locations with their specific creatures. Like God creates the sky and then he throws in birds a few days later. God creates the land and then he puts humans and land creatures there and he fills that in. And so again, how Genesis 1 is God creating order, and God building his temple to inhabit with his creatures there together. Again, you may or may not see that on a quiz here soon, in that how Genesis 1 is God setting up his temple to be with his creatures. But we see sin show its face in Genesis 3 and especially in 4, and how this offering of what was given to Adam and Eve. We had talked about it last class. What is Adam and Eve offered?
The knowledge of good and evil.
Good. But and it's delivered in the packaging of you will be like God. Again, it's the two together, and again, that may or may not show up on a quiz here in the next week or so. Or what's being offered to Adam and Eve is this ability to be like God in knowing good and evil, that the two are essentially tied together. It's not just, again, some ambiguous being like God where you reach some divine state and enhance memory and cognitive abilities to be able to understand mysteries and knowledge. But no, it's to be able to decipher and decide between good and evil. And especially when we get to the end of Genesis 11, we'll talk about what are the consistent issues between what's going on in 3 and chapter 4 of Genesis, what's going on in chapter 6 with the flood, and then again with Babel in chapter 11, because there's a word that will help tie all these stories together. But we see what happens when sin comes in and gets in the way, and how relationships with God are disordered, relationship between human beings, and then relationships with the rest of creation, namely the land. And this becomes especially true with the flood. But in order to understand the flood stories and the specific theological details that the flood is trying to share with us, we have to understand the flood within its context. And those of you that have taken cultures will know well that Israel is not the only ancient culture with its own story. And when we talk about myths, I don't mean made up stories. I need to say that because one of my buddies back in the day, he actually failed one of his polity interviews because he said there was myth in the Bible, and one of the people on the panel there didn't understand what he meant, and he didn't really understand what he was saying, and so this has a chance of getting you in trouble too. So, but I do want you to understand when I say myth, what I mean is origin stories. Origin stories. It doesn't mean factually incorrect or factually not true, or that it didn't historically happen, but rather how did these things start? How did they begin? And that the understanding of how cultures perceived their beginnings also gives us a view into the nature of the gods and their relationships. And these two things have an impact on how we understand the Hebrew Bible. That these two specific things. And so I do want to read. Is somebody want to read this?
I can read it.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Christian.
Mhm.
So there's a few things that I do want to bring up. Where in this story do you identify God's wrath being poured out? Where God's up there, he's freaking mad. That's it. I'm coming down there.
Verse 7,
Verse 7. Which part?
where he says, I'm going to blot out the humans.
Yeah. But where does it say that he's mad or that he's wrathful? He's back. He's coming back. He's coming back with the chancla to come and get him. With the belt.
It doesn't say that he was mad.
Yeah. The way this story starts out will affect the way we read the story, because again, if we only go into this thinking that God's responses are only and ever out of anger, then we're going to miss these kinds of pieces. The fact that God starts out that it grieved him to his heart, in Hebrew, what it means is God's heart was broken. That God is pained. He's grieved to his heart about what humanity has done to himself. And so that motivates God towards responding in such a way towards what's happened with these humans and what humans are doing to one another. And so again, that especially with how we can be tempted to read the Old Testament, what we fail to recognize is not only the covenant breaking that is often a part of this, but that wrath is often a response to grief. Anger is often a response to grief in some sort of way, that they're kind of two sides of the same coin. That there's a kind of betrayal or hurt that has happened in the context of relationship, and now God is responding to that. And likewise, we respond as well. Then when we're deeply hurt, we're responding to grief, and we can be tempted towards acting on that either in violent or wrathful ways, vengeful ways. And so again, what is happening here is this kind of brokenhearted response that God has towards what's happened on the earth. But again, here we don't just have one straight kind of like shot with just pure wrath being poured out, because again, we have what becomes a theme that's developed throughout the Old and New Testament, and this concept of the deliverance of the righteous or the preservation of the righteous, and how God chooses to preserve those that are dubbed faithful to him. And I don't just mean that those that have enough cognitive belief, like I believe, I trust, but no, but that those that demonstrate a certain kind of loyalty to God, and how those are preserved despite the prevalence of sin, wickedness, and violence. And so again, that this develops the theme that plays from the Old Testament to the New Testament of God's preservation of the righteous from the kind of wicked, evil, and malicious context. And you'll see that a lot in the Psalms. This phrase, deliver me, deliver me, deliver me, either whether free from enemies, whether it would be from sin. And then especially you'll see in Jesus' crucifixion some of the same themes that are developed about how God preserves the righteous. But again, that's set within the context of the prevalence of wickedness. And so again, a few things here that it begins with Yahweh being grieved from the heart because of violence that has prevailed upon the earth. That, mind you, in Genesis 6, that there's no other sin that's mentioned. Of course, yeah, again, at the start of the chapter, you do have saying that the wickedness was rampant or is widespread on the earth. But other than that, the one specific thing you have mentioned is violence. And so what is it about violence that God chooses specifically to address? And I would fair to say that it's the kind of dehumanizing element of violence that causes God to act. And so what does God do? He chooses Noah and his family. That in the context set, well, what appears to be only judgment, that you have these echoes of grace that have been present since Genesis 3 with God clothing Adam and Eve, then going out with them into what we call exile. God's marking of Cain to make sure that nobody else kills him, and how God again goes with him as he continues to travel east. And then here again that you have in the context of judgment, that you have God preserving this man and his family again in the context of wickedness and violence. And so what God essentially does, that God uncreates the world. And without looking at the slides, what does water represent in the Old Testament? Those of you that took me for Bib Little know I kept hammering this over and over and over and over again. What does water represent?
Does it represent chaos?
Hey, there you go. Chaos. Chaos. That this kind of uncreated chaos makes a comeback. And so just as sin uncreates the world, so it plunges it back into chaos. And that's what God is essentially going to do, is hit the restart button in Genesis 6. Genesis 6. And so when we read through these stories, the reason why I went through the Noah story first is as we're comparing these stories, part of the thing that might be like, well, what's the point? One of them is to be able to identify the context in which the Hebrew Bible is coming from and reading through these stories, but then also to be able to identify what are the authors trying to say specifically about Yahweh in the Old Testament that differentiates this God from all the other gods that are present within these other empires, these other civilizations. Because there's other ancient Near Eastern myths that start out with this kind of primordial realm with these waters that are present. And again, you have the presence of what's called theogony, or the birth of the gods, sometimes through procreation, sometimes through one god killing another god, sometimes another god creates another god from magic or some other means. And so again, you'll see these kinds of elements there. And then also the creation of the cosmos from primordial elements. That one created thing gives reworked and gives, again, life to another thing. And then oftentimes that you have these kind of acts of creation that take place over time, where the gods are hanging out, and then all of a sudden one procreates and gives birth to another god, and that god either creates or makes one certain part of creation, and then maybe a few days later, who knows how long goes on, but that a god is killed, and then that forms then kind of rivers. And that's, again, these creation myths that go piece by piece, oftentimes through violence and procreation. And so again, that these kinds of elements, what we find in these stories that we don't find in the Old Testament, will mark some of the differences of what we're going to see as a whole. And so you have an Egyptian, Egyptian cosmogonies. You have these brief accounts of humans being created, not very detailed. And that how human beings and the gods grow old. The human beings and the gods grow old, and they both die. But especially with the Egyptian myths, creation myths, that you have the presence of magic. And what I mean by magic isn't just alakazam, wave a stick, and things happen. but rather the harnessing of the divine for either selfish or self-intended purposes. The harnessing of the divine for one's own purposes. And so oftentimes the way that magic is, again, implemented is through word and deed. You'll see when we get to Exodus that if you haven't read through it before, what you'll find is that some of Pharaoh's magicians, we'll call them, in his own court will be able to perform some of the same kind of ritual activities, same, or not the same ritual, the same activities that Moses does. And it's thought because of the power to harness some kind of magic. And that maintenance of order, what we call ma'at, M-A apostrophe A-T, ma'at, order, was maintained through magic. And we'll talk about that when we get to talking about Pharaoh next week. Now, it's Pharaoh's responsibility to maintain order. And how he does that is through magic. Sorry, let me go back so you guys can go. Which is why Pharaoh is given the ability or given the power of magic at his coronation when he's made king. And so again, so some of the similarities between the two, you have the presence of chaos or primordial waters. You have creation done in multiple acts. Sorry, I need to crack my neck. And then you have creation happening through specific speech or the tongue by the god Ptah. And you guys will have read that in your readings and how Ptah talks and then creation kind of happens. But again, it's through magical activities by which they happen. And that Ptah is thought to harness some kind of power of the divine in order to make these things happen. But some of the differences that you'll find is that, again, the presence of multiple deities versus the monotheism that we find in Genesis 1. And this is probably better put. The early Hebrews aren't monotheists as much as they are Yahwist. And what I mean by that is that they only worship one God, which is Yahweh. Even despite the possibility of the presence of multiple deities. Again, another difference is what you have is that you have procreation that's involved with both the creation of gods and also creation of created elements versus God creating through speech. And God creating through saying, talking. Then it's also active in Genesis 2 with forming and shaping and building, planting. You know how in Egyptian myths, gods age and die. And then in Genesis, we find God is timeless. He's there. And creation proceeds from that. And so we have within Mesopotamian beginnings. And Mesopotamia is the area along modern day Iran and Iraq where Babylon would be. So you will find a lot of overlap between Babylonian myths and Mesopotamians. And these kind of beginnings are what Abraham would have understood, at least in part. That all of creation is animated. You have creation as being alive. And you have a hierarchical kind of strata amongst the gods. There you have gods that are created and ranked, and then you have a ranking among the gods based on magical prowess. And oftentimes what you'll find is that magic and violence will go hand in hand. Magic and violence will go hand in hand. And that's the way a lot of the gods will work the way up on the ladder. But with some of these stories between the Mesopotamians and the Israelites, you'll find primordial waters, creation is ordered. And again, I'm not going over these stories because you'll have gone over them in your reading. But again, to talk about some of the similarities and differences, that you have the presence of, again, polytheism, non-existence before creation. You have use of magic, again, common for the Egyptians and Mesopotamians. Procreation. And again, gods capable of dying, experiencing age. And so some of the conclusions that we can make drawing from these two things is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which again, these are two Mesopotamian Babylonian myths, and the Atrahasis epic, these two accounts of the Mesopotamian flood accounts, is that what you have is that these stories are more about how the gods are annoyed and want to wipe out the human beings more so than rather than Yahweh's uncreation of the world. Again, these stories aren't just being imported wholesale and just given a Hebrew Old Testament stamp. Again, because there is some thought that because Israel's stories aren't completely original, that they lack any kind of conclusive authority. But again, with the thought that this is primarily a theological text, and what we've been talking about again, and how God is working alongside the humans, and how these humans, while being responsible, tasked with living into this image, and again, you may see this on a quiz coming up, living into this image of being responsible to be representative of God in the world, being responsible to tend to creation, and how humans fail to do that, but rather these rebellious little creatures that continue to desire this one thing, and I'll talk about it here in a couple minutes.
I have a quick random question.
Do it.
So we were talking about how the other gods were kind of, had like these magical type of powers that were typically attached to violence. What then was like the view of how like the power of Yahweh worked? Was it also perceived as magical, or like, you know what I mean?
This gets developed because you find this in the New Testament too, where Jesus has this power and people are wondering how he's doing all these kinds of things. But specifically in the Old Testament, there is some overlap between what people perceive how Yahweh is able to kind of make things happen, and how the other gods are able to make things happen as well. Because you'll know, again, when we read through Exodus, we'll see some of these things come up again, is that Moses is seen as this person with power because he's what he's able to make happen. And eventually what we find within the text, again, the way Yahweh's power works is oftentimes counterintuitive to the way the Old Testament and the ancient Near East understands power, specifically in regards to imposing power and violence. Part of what, and this is where Exodus and the narratives in Judges kind of come into tension, because in Exodus, yeah, it seems that as the text kind of keeps going and God trying to get the people out of Egypt, the first thing he does, try to talk it out. Okay, doesn't want to do it. Well, let me go send 1 plague, 2 plagues, 3 plagues. All right. And eventually by the end of it, let me talk to Pharaoh in a way he's going to understand, which means death of the firstborn. But then he still doesn't let up. And so the ways in which, again, that the ancient peoples understood power and the way it was demonstrated in relationship to God is often counterintuitive. And so it's another critique against not just the use of power by humans, but then also the distinction of Yahweh from other gods in the ancient Near East. But he does play into that sometimes, where God speaks to humans in ways that are very similar to the culture, because what you have, again, in something like Judges, and especially in Joshua, where you have these conquest stories. And conquest was one of the ways that the deities expressed their superiority over other deities. And again, you'll know that from cultures, that you have these local gods that are prevalent within these little cities. And when one city took over another, or one empire took over another, that god was superior to the one that got overthrown. And so, again, that in the ways that people understood it, it would have been a merging of the two. It's not completely original for God to be the way he is, but what is innovative in the way that Yahweh's relationship with humanity is that he's much more amicable, and that he invites partnership with the humans.
So that would be like an example of like when you're talking about the conquest thing, is like like God meeting them where they are type thing.
Exactly. Exactly. So
No further questions, Your Honor.
there you go. What you just said in about 4 seconds, it took me like 5 minutes. So, but yeah, but again, there's a lot of layers to it because of the fact that like it's not just prescriptive. Once God is this way, He's always that way. Because again, He's meeting humans in different places and speaking and working within a developing culture and a developing context. And so, again, it's the tension between the God of the Hebrews who are told to slaughter the Canaanites, while the God of Jesus Christ is the one who sends His only Son in order to die on a cross for those those who hate Him. So um, again, and it's not one or the other; it's still the same God. But again, how we go about navigating the God who's working within these cultures, and so which again, that's part of the next kind of couple of points is that these creation stories have political and religious significance. That these aren't just Sunday school stories to remember and to turn into epic, ill-detailed movies starring Russell Crowe. And that it's Yahweh who creates, not Marduk, Ptah, or Pharaoh. And again, this will have tremendous impact when the people head down into Egypt and they face an empire that is much, much stronger than they are, even though they lack the numbers, seems like. Another important point is God speaks through cultures to people. That to know the story in part, if not whole, means to know the God within the story. And so again, to see some of these differences in the way God's being talked about and what's being communicated here. One of these days, computer's going to respond. And so the next story, Babel. So we see here what's the artistic rendition of the Tower of Babel. You have what happened is that the gods would be here up at the top in the heavens, and the humans would go up and would meet with the gods, talk, hang out, come back down. And so it's a place for the gods and humanity to meet. And so you have a kind of temple structure that is being built by these humans, which appears to be some kind of ziggurat structure. Again, kind of a windy staircase. And you see kind of humans down here. There's little tiny little specks right here. Those are humans. Kind of we're supposed to work their way up and descend into a garden area at the base within the worship complex. And so there's a couple things that I do want to bring up with us before we take a break here in a few minutes. That now with the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come." This is the part I want us to remember, to hear, to listen, pay attention to. "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." And so you have some of the connections between Babel and Theomachy, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, but to bring it up again, do you have some of the similarities between Enuma Elish and the ziggurat of Babylon? That you have Marduk, again, who gained supremacy over all the gods after the battle. And what does he do? He sets up his temple in Babel or Babylon. And literally Babel or Babylon in Hebrew just means gibberish. There's no like real word for it. That's like blah, blah, blah. A bit of an onomatopoeia. And so in Genesis 1 through 11, that the reminder that Yahweh has supremacy from the beginning, uncreated, undermines all human structures, including the temple at Babel. And you have Babel as this kind of last stand between God and between humanity against God, and Yahweh confuses that attempt. And again, this last part may show up in a quiz here soon. That what ties the two stories together between the flood and Babel, especially, is this kind of thwarting of the attempts of humans to undermine God. And so that being said, Theomachy, understood as a war or struggle against God or among or against the gods. How do these stories between the flood and Babel function as Theomachy or a struggle with? Talk to me. Is this your card?
Like you just said,
And
it undermines supremacy or God's supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And what about Genesis 3? Brings it, do you bring in?
was it when they made coverings for themselves? When they, well, first when Eve was deceived by the serpent and she ate of the fruit. And then when they heard God was coming, they hid themselves and made coverings.
Yep. Yeah, that's definitely part of it. What else? What else you guys seen between Genesis 3 and these kind of stories?
All of it is in opposition to the order that God had instituted.
There you go, Samantha. And what parts are you seeing between the stories? Like, give me a couple of connections or some allusions. Because what had God said in Genesis 3 that kind of creates the order that they were supposed to stick to?
Don't eat the fruit and then dominion over all things, pretty much. Or
Yep. And we see how that kind of doesn't necessarily work, where the humans don't necessarily participate in that. But Samantha, what do you see in 6 and 9 where you have um, kind of struggle with God?
Are we talking about Babel?
Yeah, the flood or Babel. Yeah.
With the flood, actually no, I'll talk about Babel.
Yeah. Go ahead.
They build a tower and then they want to sort of like glorify themselves because they want
There
him
you
to
go.
and then they want his blessing, but in a place of worship. So
Hmm.
something that should have glorified him, really they want him to come down for their own self gain.
Yeah. What word do you see repeated there? Let me go back a few slides so you guys can see it. What word do you see repeated right there in verse 4? A real short word, but
ourselves.
that one's repeated, but there's another one that
Let
partners well
us.
with it. Yeah. The phrase let us, let us, let us, let us. And again, it's oftentimes self-serving. And so Samantha, you brought it up perfectly that so much of what's going on here alludes to what we had described as rebellion, but more specifically, the way I want to point this is in autonomy, self-rule. Again, the ability to decipher, not just decipher between good and evil, but to pronounce for oneself what is good and what is evil, what is beneficial and what is detrimental, outside of God's own wisdom. That again, the picture that Genesis 1 and 2 are trying to portray is as God as a king and these humans as co-regents or co-rulers alongside him, but God is always the supreme king. But when these humans decide to go about their own, do their own things, and again, to decide for themselves what is good and what is evil, that's when trouble ensues. And again, as a reminder, as I had on the last slide, and just to remind you again, that Yahweh has supremacy from the beginning, including the temple at Babel. And so what happens when autonomy starts to not just get in the way, but starts to become the preferred option for humans rather than faith and obedience?
I just want to make a comment real quick.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't know why, but while I was reading all of this and what you're talking about autonomy and deciding whether good is what is good and what is evil, I
Yeah.
couldn't help but like the one thing that came to my mind is this is what's happening now in our world. At least for me, that's kind of the way that I perceive it. Um, I
Yeah.
feel like
Talk about it.
yeah, I just feel like people have just forgotten about God and they're saying, okay, like let me decide what's good and let me decide what's evil. One way that I can see it is like for me, when I talk to people about God and like our world, if I mention the Bible, it means nothing to them. So
Yeah.
it's kind of, I don't know, I just that's the way that I see it like going. It was a thought that always came to my mind. Every single little thing that I read, I was like, oh, I can connect it to what's happening in our world now.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially, I mean, and it's not to get apocalyptic or anything like that. Like, oh man, the flood's gonna happen any day now, and because it's gonna rain this weekend, that means God's bringing about judgment. Um, but for the fact that humans don't have a great track record when they decide I'm gonna do whatever I want to do, even under the guise well intended, but without much um, accountability, is only God can judge me. Well, that might be true, but it still has implications on how it affects other people. And so again, that um, the decisions that are being made, either political, ecological, agricultural, and even more local. Again, need local decisions, political, spiritual decisions be made at churches. Just all these different decisions that are being made, sometimes for us, and sometimes the decisions that we make on ourselves. The kind of foolishness that it is, and Proverbs reminds us well of this. Of life lived outside of Yahweh's leading and guidance, that there is a kind of wisdom to be had in faithfulness and obedience. Doesn't mean it's always going to look perfect and look clean and nice, as Abraham's story does, and we'll get to that after the break. But um, that there's a kind of wisdom to obedience and a kind of foolishness to disobedience or rebellion. And again, a lot of these stories is that's what it's pointing to. That there's a kind of destructive foolishness that comes with disobedience. Of what happens when we don't love God and don't love neighbor as we love ourselves. And so, thank you for that, Still appreciate it. A lot to think about. So much to think about. And so let's go ahead and take a break. We got to this point much earlier than I thought, pleasantly. So let's go ahead and take. Oh, your boy needs like a 23-minute break. Let's go ahead and meet back up at 2:55. We meet back up at 2:55. That's a great picture, Jasper. Seems like forever ago now. But as I had mentioned at the top of the class, as we talk to the patriarchs, this isn't to minimize the role of women within these narratives. But again, working with Hebrew culture, alongside Hebrew culture, understanding Hebrew culture, that so much of the narratives follow the patterns of males within the stories. And so, again, why patriarchy? Well, one of them is that the weight of evidence indicates a kind of male dominance as the rule within these ancient systems. And that patriarchal lineage, as well as inheritance systems, were the norm of being passed along in patriarchal systems against through the males. You could think Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac, Jacob, and Esau, Jacob and his 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, Moses, Joshua, and then David and Solomon. Again, the kind of passing along through males. And again, this is not to prescribe a certain kind of culture, its expectations, its values, as much as it is to say that God is able to work within a certain culture without necessarily baptizing it as the only way. The part of what also were some of the conditions, a part of this culture, that the heads of household had complete charge of the household's property. And you guys don't remember from Biblit that we pick up on some of these themes of using head of household, using some patriarchy, and how God works with that to be able to tell a detailed story about how he is inviting humanity within his household, and how those who pledge allegiance to Jesus, those who put their confidence, their trust in him, are now brought into God's family with him as the patriarch, as the head of the household. And again, this is more so how Yahweh condescends to cultural norms with the intention of transcending those cultural norms. Again, the intention of Yahweh's condescension in order to transcend. The Yahweh stoops down in order to meet some of the norms, in order to work past them. And you see this happen a lot with Jesus. And again, the fact that Yahweh addresses females, excuse me, not only the fact that Yahweh addresses females, but that Yahweh's use of females to move the narrative forward. Again, it's counterintuitive, it's countercultural to ancient Near Eastern cultures. And so Abraham, as you guys are reading through the story, one of the things you guys will notice about Abraham, one, his story picks up really quickly. And that you have, I jump back and forth between Abram and Abraham. His name starts out as Abram and then gets moved over to Abraham. We'll talk about that. But that Abram serves as a model for trust, of what we might call faith, that he exercises and the obedience he exhibits. What makes Abram a model isn't so much this kind of supernatural ability as much as it is his simple obedience. And this serves again as a model for the covenant community. And again, considering what we've already been through with the stories in Genesis 3, with Cain and Abel, with Adam and Eve, like I alluded to with Genesis 3, like the flood, like the Tower of Babel, we will find a contrast between Abraham and the stories that have preceded him. But where the contrasts begin and where they're most stark, again, is within the context of disobedience, which you call rebellion. And then the contra of that, again, is that trust or loyalty. And this is why it's really important that when we talk about faith, it has to be more than just belief. Those kind of cognitive things we believe about Jesus, we believe about God. Well, I have faith. I have you just got to have faith and those kinds of things without really giving some more meat to it. And there's something about a kind of trust or loyalty that, at least for me, that I hope that's something that helps you guys out and hopes that you get something to adopt. But there's something about trust or loyalty. It demands more. That we have faith in a lot of things, but we're not loyal or devoted to a lot. We might trust a lot of things, but yeah, to put our complete trust or confidence in, that might be a little bit of a different story. And so we find within Abraham his kind of obedient response, again, in contrast to what's happened in Genesis 3 through 11. And so I'll talk about it right now, and I'll come back to this, but Genesis, we'll find that now the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house. This threefold go: your country, your kindred, your father's house. Country, your people. your kindred, the kind of relationships, the community that you're a part of, and then your father's house, your specific family, to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So you have this twofold command. Now, one of them, a kind of physical relocation. Hey, go to this land that I will show you. Why? Because we find here that go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house. What Abraham is essentially doing is forsaking his inheritance as a father's son. What Abraham is essentially doing is forsaking his inheritance as his father's son. And again, it's hard enough for us to leave home, or at least a lot of us, because of the expectation, especially for you women, that a lot of times the expectation is on you that you will stay home until you get married. I know that's the expectation for a lot of you Latinas, and maybe for other cultures as well. It's always the expectation that you're home until you get married, and you leave before that. Well, what's wrong with you? Like the only kind of okay thing, maybe for a job, maybe for school, but usually that's going to, well, look for something closer. Look for something closer. And so for males, it can be true, but not necessarily always. But notwithstanding some of the kind of cultural nuances that within the text of what Abraham or Abram is doing is radical, and that he's cutting himself off from any kind of possibility that he'll be able to live off the inheritance that his father is able to provide for him, thus having to fully rely on God to come through. And that be a blessing, it's a kind of understanding that the promise is not just for Abraham and his family, but for the whole earth as a consequence of having done the first thing, which is to go. Go to a land which I will show you. And so you have that kind of two kind of consequences. The first section focuses on the national blessing promised to Abraham, again, that international focus. But that the second one, this kind of international blessing, the way in which Abraham's descendants will be a blessing to all of the peoples on the earth, is dependent on that first one of Abraham going. And so we have here within Genesis 15. So we have essentially what we have here is this first part of the covenant. I'm going to get into more detail by the end because we're going to cover 3 chapters, 12, 15, and 17, which if there's, again, chapters to remember as you're thinking through Abrahamic covenant, 12, 15, 17, just kind of skip around, 12, 15, 17. That after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, this man shall not be your heir, nor no one but your very own issue shall be your heir. Literally in Hebrew, that very own issue, somebody from your loins. One from your own loins shall be your heir. So he, the Lord, brought him, Abraham, outside and said, look toward heaven and count the stars, if you're able to count them. Then he said to them, so shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord. He trusted the Lord. His confidence was in the Lord. Again, the kind of loyalty or devotion that is in the Lord. And the Lord reckoned it or counted it to him as righteousness. And as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. And the Lord said to Abram, know for this for certain that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between those pieces. And on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land. To your descendants I give this land, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, to the river Euphrates, and thus will end the passage. So again, here we have another layer being added to the covenant initially made in chapter 12. That what you have is this introduction by a sacrificial ritual. And again, this part that focuses on international blessing, that it's not just for Abraham or Abram and his family to hoard as God's own specific people, but that through Abram and his people's loyalty to Yahweh as the only God, the other nations on the earth will be recipients of this blessing. So obedience and international blessing go hand in hand. Obedience and blessing go hand in hand. And so again, the reason why I bring this up is that if we go back to Genesis 1, specifically in regards to the human beings living out their image of God, calling of being God's representatives upon the earth, it's through obedience, it's through obedience or loyalty that this then starts to get fulfilled. This responsibility of being stewards on the earth and reflecting God upon the earth, that's when it gets fulfilled. Again, I want to make that really specific because this will have implications in the way that we understand not only Jesus, but ultimately our own calling upon the earth, because this is a lot bigger than just working at a church and going to church on Sundays. That each one of you have a part to play in the way God is going about redeeming the earth, redeeming humans back to himself through the work which we are all a part of. That through obedience of God's people, that all the peoples on the earth will be what we call blessed or recipients of God's salvation. But again, God making this promise of land to Abraham or Abram and his descendants. You'll notice here that when the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. And what this represents is what we call a theophany. 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 That it's an appearance of the divine or a divine manifestation of the gods or God himself. And so what happens is that God goes between the pieces that have been chopped up and essentially saying between himself and Abraham that if I do not make this thing happen, if your descendants do not go and possess this land which I am promising to them, may what happened to these carcasses of these animals so happen to me. Now, I don't know how in the world you're going to chop up God into pieces, but that is essentially what he is promising. Because again, at that time, what you would do is you would have two parties who would walk in between the animals, and their feet would get covered with blood, their robes covered with blood, to represent not just the sealing of this covenant oath, but also may whoever breaks this oath, may what happened to these animals happen to them. And God alone takes this promise upon himself, demanding very little from Abraham other than obedience and loyalty. And so God putting himself at risk that if he does not fulfill what he is promising to Abram, then he's, again, putting his own life on the line. Again, communicating to Abram in terms that he would understand, in terms that early readers would understand about the degree and the quality of promise that God is making. He's not just kind of haphazardly making, yeah, I think I'll do it. I'll try my best. But no, the finality and the seriousness by which God is promising to make these things happen because of Abram's allegiance or faith in God. And so again, we're adding another layer with Genesis 17, and we'll tie these things together really cleanly for you guys here. That in Genesis 17, that when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you and will make you exceedingly numerous. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout the generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. Excuse me. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land where you are now an alien, all the land of Canaan, for perpetual holding it. I will be their God. God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. And those of you that have taken BLE, working on your Galatians project, you'll know the role of circumcision, the kind of finality of it. But there's three parts to this. Again, this kind of international significance of Abram getting his name changed to Abraham, of Sarai getting her name changed to Sarah. That this major significance, again, not only designates the transformation of character, but also of destiny. This transformation both of character and destiny. And the approach by God to Abraham, this walk before me and be blameless, entails the kind of demand for, again, for loyalty. This expectation of loyalty by a subject. And again, it's not so much the demand for perfection, but the demand for loyalty. Oh, my neck's being weird. So are there any questions before we... Yeah, I know you guys had read through some of this. You guys are reading, but I did want to point a few more things out. That you have a kind of covenant obligation between the ethical and the ritual. That the kind of demand, again, for obedience, which is demanded by covenant, is the expectation. And that'll get especially drawn out in the Exodus. But here we find another a difference between God and the other deities, because whereas pagan gods, the deities that were common in the ancient Near East, were identified with a specific place, with a specific region. That you have Baal, or you have Marduk, who's god of Babylon, or one of the gods amongst Babylon. Baal, who's the god in Canaan. You have Molech, who's god of the Amorites. Ashtoreth, who's in there. I believe she's with the Philistines. But you have these multiple gods that are regional deities, but God doesn't designate himself to a people, but he doesn't designate himself to a place, but identifies himself with a people. And this is really, really, really important. Again, that God does not attach himself to a specific place, but rather to a very specific people, his people. His people. And so when we talk about the Abrahamic covenant, it brings up three things. And luckily, there are only three P's: people, place, and presence. And so you may see this on a quiz moving forward. But the Abrahamic covenant consists of three things: of people, of place, and of presence. That people mean descendants. Of place. This land that I will show you, which God tells Abraham, which we find out later on is the land of Canaan. And then of presence, God's presence with the people, that I will be your God and they will be my people. That this, the Abrahamic covenant becomes so foundational to the way Israel not only understands God, but also understands themselves and the way God relates to his people. Which again, that God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which you will see come up again in Exodus, you'll see it come up in Numbers, and especially in Deuteronomy, that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has appeared to us. That again, this calling back to this Abrahamic covenant, calling back to the God who had revealed himself as one who promised descendants, who promised a place, the land of Canaan, and who promised his presence with his people. And that it's also recalling how God has brought Abraham and his entire household or descendants into his household and under his care. That this is a God who identifies himself again, not just to a place, but to a people. And again, even with the phrase the God of Israel, it's not, again, so much a designation of place as much as it is a designation for people. And so, are there any questions thus far? Any questions before we move on to the next thing? All right. So what I want you guys to do, I'm going to go ahead and send you guys into breakout rooms here to make some connections. Now, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are connected by certain phrases and promises. Utilizing or using what we already know from Genesis 12 through 17, read through the following text and describe some of those connections. What are some of the words, some of the phrases that we find that are similar between the two as we're moving through it? I'm going to go ahead and share this with you guys so you guys can see what I'm looking at. So again, to make some of the connections between the text, what kinds of words, what kind of phrases, is there any motifs that you find that are similar? What are the promises that are being made that are similar between the texts? And again, utilizing what we've just talked about with Abraham and covenant. How do the stories of Isaac and Jacob tie together? What are some of the things being promised that could potentially be describing the two? So again, I'm going to go ahead and send you guys up into groups, and then we'll take a few minutes to talk about it, and then we'll get back together. Again, if you don't have your camera on, want to turn your camera on and just let your group members know, hey, I'm here. Let's talk about it, be about it. Let me... All right. And I'll give you guys about 7 minutes or 6 minutes to work on it. I know, not, we can't capture all the brilliance. Can't capture all of it, but there we go. We'll get the rest of it. All right. So next with Isaac, that the Lord appeared to Isaac and said, don't go down into Egypt and settle back in the land that I shall show you. Settle in the land that I shall show you. Who does that sound a lot like? Not everybody at once. Who does that sound like? Abraham. There you go, Vanessa. Abraham. Reside in this land as an alien, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will fulfill the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, and I will give to your offspring all these lands, and all the nations of the earth shall gain blessing for themselves through your offspring, because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Good. So again, you see these kind of repetitions given to Abraham, Isaac, who's a son who has been promised the fulfillment of this kind of blessing, that you have this, again, the promise of land, place, descendants, people, presence, people, place, presence, people, place, presence. This is going to get repeated over and over again, especially for Isaac, and then it'll come up again with Jacob. It came up with Isaac, and it will come up again with Jacob. This kind of repetition shows this connection between Abraham and then Isaac. Again, to highlight and to accentuate, to intensify, there you go, people, place, presence, to intensify the surety of God's promise of making these things come to pass. People, place, and presence. And so Jacob. And again, you have the interaction between sibling beef, which we've already seen happen between Jacob and Esau. We saw with Cain and Abel. So those of you that are a lot like me, that come from broken families, take heart. You're not the only one. We've got family issues, sibling beef, issues between parents. Rebecca and Isaac also had issues too. Jacob and his wives have issues too. Mind you, Jacob doesn't just have a wife, he's got multiple wives. And the Bible doesn't commend this, nor does it glorify it, but it's a part of the messy story. Again, nowhere in the Bible is polygamy prescribed as the order of things, nor is it normalized. But it is a part of the story, messy part of the story too. And so the connections again to Genesis 1 through 11, then you have covenant being repeated. You have the rival sons, again, Joseph and his brothers. You have the seed theme, again, of being a blessing to the nations. So did he try to get revenge on his brother for stealing his blessing? Well, Jacob runs around and runs away from Esau. Esau does try to get at him, try to kill him, but he does. Ultimately, they make peace with one another. And I'll talk about that right now. You have Jacob contending with God and parallels, and we'll talk about this with Noah and Babel. And then barrenness comes up again. And so you see Jacob's family tree. You have Leah and Zilpah, Leah and her servant. Then you have Rachel and Bilhah, Rachel and Rachel's servant. And so again, you see Rachel who struggles with barrenness, Leah who's able to bear many kids, and because of rivalry, you see these servant women that are used in the story to kind of get at one another, especially their sisters. Man, siblings can do some messed up things to each other. But it's from this messy situation that we have the 12 tribes of Israel that are formed. And you see Joseph there, his coat of many colors. Get some water real quick. But with the Jacob narrative, the way it starts out will be a lot of the ways that it plays out. Now, Jacob, who gets his name heel catcher, not so much for his ability to grab somebody's foot as much as it is, though he was born holding onto his brother's foot, but that it's more supplanter, trickster, what we might call a finagler, jokester, joker, chistoso. And this phrase, the older shall serve the younger, and this exchange of birthright factors into this story prominently, especially with the parents. And again, for the sake of time, we won't necessarily go too far into it, but you have favoritism played between the parents, specifically between Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac, who has a preference for Esau because he's a hunter and can cook for him. And you have Jacob, who spends a lot of time around the house with his mom as a favorite son. And Rebecca, she plays a large part in the narrative in so much as she helps Jacob to deceive Isaac, and thus Jacob procures the blessing he takes a hold of the blessing. You have, again, Rebecca, who kind of plays like the crafty one who is able to outmaneuver, outsmart the male in order to be able to make happen what needs to happen, which again, it's part of the way God had ordered things. And so again, and this isn't to again point towards any kind of craftiness or shiftiness or shadiness amongst females, as much as it is, again, part of what's being communicated is God's use of women within in patriarchal narrative stories where it would have been shameful for these kinds of inclusions. But yet those are the individuals that God uses. And we'll see this especially with the in Exodus. And so the kind of blessing that is given to Jacob, that he will, that the dew of heaven that rests on the land or on Jacob and the people, that talking about a kind of abundance. You have grain and wine that are produced and for peoples to serve Jacob, that he's going to be able to have the best of the soil, but then also be able to enlist military power amongst the people. And so Isaac, who is old in age, after Esau comes in, realizes he's made a mistake, and then but the blessing's already been given. And that God works out his plan nonetheless, and that Jacob must remain blessed. And so Isaac continues to bless Jacob. And so let me let me go ahead and end here because we only got a few minutes left. Let me go over here. What does Esau blessing me that Isaac gives him? What do you mean by that, Vanessa?
Because I remember reading it and Esau was begging Isaac to give him a blessing, and Isaac does eventually give him a blessing, which I'm a little confused on what it kind of means.
Yeah, so that particular part, what he's essentially asking, he could be asking one or two things. One of them, he's asking for his dad to reverse it, like, hey, give me my birthright back. Or the second thing is like, hey, there's got to be something for me, so give me part of the inheritance that's yours. And so again, it's kind of dishing out part of the inheritance of what he has left to give him. And so, which is why, again, part of it is the pronouncement of Esau as a wild man and having his own people, and that they're always going to be fighting amongst each other. That Esau, and this is an important point to note, Esau's descendants will become known as the Edomites. Edom, and they will come back into the picture. They'll hang around in the narratives like in Kings and Samuel, but especially I believe it's in Nahum. They're specifically addressed. Or is it Obadiah? And one of the prophets, Edom is specifically addressed, and it feels me to remember off the top of my head. But that's Israel's cousins, that they're descended from the same people, and so in a lot of ways that they share a lot of similarities. But that what Isaac is asking, or no, what Esau is asking of Isaac is essentially, give me some of what you gave to Jacob. And so again, it's part of it having to do with inheritance, the other one having to do with the promises that were given over to Isaac. Okay, so let me go ahead and share this with you guys. You can see. Forgot to include this, but it's really important. So Genesis 32, or 32, starting at verse 22. That same night that Jacob, got up, took his 2 wives and his 2 maids and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok, or Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything he had. Then Jacob was left alone, and the man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob said to him, I will not let you go until you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then the man said, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And then he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. And the sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because because God struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. So it's a little bit of midrash there.
People refer to this angel as Jesus sometimes.
Yeah, they do, but again, it's more. It ought to be left more mysterious than the way it's prescribed, because again,
Out of context type stuff.
yeah, we're kind of reading into it a little bit. But you have this confrontation when Jacob is alone in the wilderness, and what Jacob's demand there is for a blessing. And part of it does happen. Jacob is given his request of being blessed, but what is more significant here again is more of a change in name, which again happens to Abraham, and it affects a change in destiny. That this event assures that he will become the patriarch of a nation named Israel. And again, you will see these phrases come up: God of Jacob or God of Israel, referring again to these kind of events where God binds himself to a people to give them a place. Whereas Jacob, who's the hill catcher or the trickster, that you have Jacob as Israel, who wrestles or fights with God Elohim. And that this special relationship between God and Israel will mark their relationship. That you have wrestled with Elohim, you have wrestled with God and prevailed. That there will be this special relationship between God and this people that will be called Israel later. Geez, my neck is hurting. And so you have Jacob, who is blessed. Again, that kind of reaffirmation of destiny, which is related to covenant, which you guys already read. And this command and blessing, this be fruitful and multiply, the promise of people, of ruling military power, and the promise of land. Again, you don't have necessarily presence being promised again, but the assumption is that because God is with the people, therefore victory. Sorry, I'm like rubbing my neck. Because God is with the people, then victory is ensured. But if God is not with the people, then victory, it will be very difficult, if not impossible. And so again, the ideas and the themes that tie together the stories between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this promise of people, place, and presence, which forms the foundation for when we approach Exodus, these three things will be threatened. Will God have a people? Because they will go down into Egypt to be oppressed. Will God's people have a place? Because again, they are in a foreign land when drought hits. And what has happened to the presence of God? Because God doesn't show up until the end of the second chapter in Exodus. And oppression gets worse and worse and worse and worse as God's people travel from the land of Canaan down into Egypt. But that being said, are there any questions, comments, concerns? Questions. Okay, and just as a quick reminder, let me go over here and show you guys. A quick reminder, again, for next week, you guys, session timed out. For next week, you guys do have a quiz. The quiz is done here. You'll get it done quick. I know you guys will. You guys get as many times as you guys need to take it for your reading quiz. If you guys are looking for more information specifically this week, there's a couple of articles that I signed down here. Again, works written by Black Old Testament scholars, as well as Toledoth and the structure of Genesis. I didn't get into it too much, but this article is actually, it's a short article, really helpful for understanding Genesis through this phrase Toledoth. Just means the generations of the generations, and so really, really helpful. But again, here's your reading. And for next week, I know we don't have any class, but I will be posting a lecture for you guys to watch. It'll be short and working in conjunction with this worksheet. So if you guys don't have any questions, you guys have an absolutely awesome Monday. I'll be here for a couple minutes if you need. If not, you guys have a beautiful Monday. See you guys.
Thank you, Professor.